Before this video starts, I'd just like to make an announcement. I have the Liberal Tears mug for $14.99 on my website. It is the first link in the description if you want to go pick one up. Don't worry if it breaks when it comes to your house. I'll send you another one for free out of my pocket. I don't care. I want you to get your Liberal Tear mug. It comes in Liberal Tears white with the face, black with the face, white without the face, and black without the face. So pick whichever one you want, and it'll come to your door in about 3 to 5 days. So that should be epic. First link in the description. Thank you. Let's go on with the video.
Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. And as I say, if you disagree, then I'm always eager to talk with people who disagree because it's fun to have discussions. So you get to go first if you disagree.
Well, I didn't expect the first one down here, but I disagree with you on a couple points, Ben.
Sure.
First, let me introduce myself. My name is Cash Jackson. I'm a retired Navy veteran. And
well, thank you for your service.
Thank you. I am also intending on running for governor 2018 here in the state of Illinois. And I wanted to specifically address where you spoke about victimization and people coming from impoverished neighborhoods, that poverty wasn't kind of what you equated to for criminal activity, and that addressing crime by putting more police into these inner city communities would be the resolution to said criminal activity. I just want to challenge that thought process on a couple of points.
Sure.
Beginning with my personal opinion, and some of this is going to be rooted in facts and others just in my observations,
That's fine.
is that the majority of crime that's being committed in these inner city neighborhoods, if we look at prison statistics, if we look at gang violence, we look at drug abuse, we look at teen pregnancy, suicide and depression amongst our youth, there's one common denominator. That common denominator is that these children are growing up in fatherless homes. They're growing up in fatherless homes not because fathers are not present and because we have a plethora of deadbeat fathers, which has been painted through the media that there's millions of deadbeat fathers out there. That's simply not the truth. What is the truth is that the states have found it profitable by misappropriating Title IV-D funding through the Social Security Act from the federal government down to the states. The states take a parent, which is historically and statistically the father, they relegate them down to a visitor during a custody proceeding, such as my case. So I hope that you can smear this over your website. They reduce me down to a visitor status to justify a child support order. When they do that and they force that collection process, they receive federal funding directly to the state.
Okay, so sorry, I don't want to break up the long paragraphs there, but you know more about custody battles than I do, okay? I will just say that obviously custody battles only take place in a situation in which there's a conflict between the spouses. I mean, I assume that you and your spouse don't get along great.
Well,
I mean...
Let me finish just addressing. I know I'm long-winded.
Sorry, one more comment. The fact is that it is not custody battles. The custody battles are not the reason 70% of black kids are born out of wedlock and 40% of white kids are born out of wedlock. It's because people are having sex out of wedlock and having babies.
That's correct. But when that child support order is put in place, okay, in order to justify the support order, they have to take one parent, which historically is the father, and say, you're only going to get every other weekend. And when we do that, we have set the stage for emotional and mental challenges for those individuals. And again, if you look at teen pregnancy statistics, drug abuse statistics.
So I agree with you about the correlation between all these terrible things and single motherhood. I just disagree with you statistically that cases of father visitation in divorce cases represent even a large minority of the cases of single motherhood. Again, the vast majority of, if we're talking about the sort of culture of single motherhood that's been created in the United States, it is not about custody hearings. It is about the fact that people are getting pregnant before they're married, out of wedlock, and having babies without a father even in the home. This is not to diminish the problems in custody battles. There's no question that a lot of custody law is biased toward the mother. That's been true for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. But to pretend that that is the main problem facing inner city communities, for example, ignores the fact that the vast majority of people who are having babies out of wedlock are having them out of wedlock. They're not having them in wedlock and then dad is taking off. Dad's taking off because they never got married. Okay, this is why marriage is a prerequisite.
Well, I believe, Ben, that if you look at, say, the south side of Chicago and the west side of Chicago, if you look at that and the crime that is there today, you can trace that back to Jim Crow, to the war on drugs, to mass incarceration. And when fathers were taken out in large numbers over a long duration, you now have set the stage where you have so many children being had out of wedlock because the family unit has broken down in these.
No, the increase in single motherhood is not based in Jim Crow. Because the fact is that at the end of Jim Crow, the black single motherhood rate was 20%. Today it's 72%. Okay, so did society get more racist? How did that happen? Was it just a ticking time bomb that they left under the kitchen table? The fact is that people are having babies out of wedlock now because there are government structures in place that basically incentivize people to have babies out of wedlock, and that's the real problem. Now, in terms of crime, obviously crime is involved with single motherhood. What I'm suggesting is that there are two ways to tackle this problem. One is a broader cultural critique in which we say to people, you need to get married, and that means getting people involved in church and synagogue, getting people involved in a social network that encourages people to get married before they have babies. That's a long-term project because it takes 100 years for an entire society to devolve to the point where a majority of babies are being born out of wedlock in a community or a vast minority in the white community. That's one way to tackle it. A shorter-term way to tackle crime is to put all the criminals in prison. Because again, I think that sets off a chain reaction that's actually good. And the chain reaction is that now you can have businesses invest. I'm not going to take my money and invest in a store that I think is going to be robbed tomorrow because the crime rate is high. I'm only going to invest where I think the cops are going to protect. And if there are no cops there to protect, it's hard for me to invest. Once I invest, that creates a property tax base or a local taxation base. And now you actually have the money, if you want a good public school, to actually put together a good public school. So all of these things need to happen at once. But the only quarrel I have with you at all is I think that you're taking an anecdote and expanding it out statistically where that's not actually statistically valid.
So you don't believe that the federal incentives to the states, for the states to receive federal funding based on their forced collection of child support?
No, I'm not arguing with you on that. You may very well be right. I don't know enough about that to answer that question. All I'm saying is that if you're talking about child support as the lead problem in these communities, there we disagree. I'm sorry, I have to move on because there's a lot of other questions.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your talk today, and that's coming from someone who disagrees with basically everything you say.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
But yeah,
Thank you for coming.
So today you had a Twitter thread in response to Ted Lieu's comments on health insurance and the CBO report that
Yes.
came out about why pre-existing conditions should be charged more. For those with pre-existing conditions that become priced out of the market due to them being charged more, which I understand your reasoning behind, car insurance, stuff like that. I read the thread.
Well, I mean, to reiterate my point to people who don't understand, just so if you're coming in late to this conversation, Ted Lieu tweeted something out about how it's ridiculous basically for insurance companies to charge people with pre-existing conditions more, to which I said, it's an insurance company, of course it does. I mean, every insurance company in history charges people more based on their risk profile. That's why you have risk assessors at insurance companies. So go ahead.
Yeah, my question is for the people who are priced out of the market
Yes.
due to that, is their only solution to go without health care? And why do you think that's an acceptable solution when most other nations have found a solution?
No, I don't think that's an acceptable solution. I think what we need to do is we've trained now 3 generations of Americans to be dependent on the government to fill that gap. So there are a couple of ways that you can tackle these issues. The chief problem, and I think we all acknowledge this, is that people don't buy. Let's say that everyone were age 0 for a second. Okay, everyone was born today. How do you solve the healthcare problem? You don't really have to solve the healthcare problem because people, presumably, you train them to buy insurance when they're young. The big problem is people don't buy insurance when they're young. Now they're 60, they don't have insurance, they have pre-existing conditions, and now no one's going to cover them, right? So we all know that the problem in the future is not going to be people who are 65 because in 50 years, 40 years, 30 years, they'll be dead, right? The big problem is going to be people who are 20 who are not getting health insurance now, and then in 40 years, they have a pre-existing condition, they look for health insurance. So if we're talking about the future and the future plans for healthcare, what we need to be doing is encouraging young people to buy health insurance. Well, there are only two ways to do that. One is to use the government to force people to buy health insurance, and the other way is to basically have a market system that punishes people for not buying health insurance. Okay, the way you have a market system that punishes people for not buying health insurance is you make it very clear to people that there's a moral hazard involved here, that if you don't buy health insurance, that you're going to be paying more in the long run, so you'd better, well, pay health insurance right now and make smart decisions about it. Now, for the people who fall through the cracks, as I say, there's two groups now that we're talking about. There's people who are old and have pre-existing conditions, and it's too late for them. What do? They can't go back to being 20 and buy health insurance when they were healthy, right? So for those people, obviously, we have to have some sort of backup that phases out over time, right? That doesn't work the same way for a 60-year-old as it works for a 40-year-old or a 30-year-old who can buy when they're healthy, because we want to encourage those people to buy, not to be relying on government. And there I'm not against the idea of a phased-out government program based on age that helps subsidize people in pre-existing condition situations. And the other thing is that you have to have private charity pick up the slack for a lot of this stuff. And this is where I've said that I think that private charity does pick up the slack for a lot of things. I mean, you know, Jimmy Kimmel made obviously a big to-do when he did a routine on his show in which he talked about how his baby son had been born. They took him to Children's Hospital. He had an open heart surgery. And that's why you need Obamacare. Okay, Jimmy Kimmel didn't have Obamacare. Jimmy Kimmel had private insurance. The fact is that private insurance, which covers the vast majority of the market, is still covering of pre-existing conditions, because when you are employed and you have insurance, you're pooled with all the other employees of your company. That's the way it works, right? They don't charge you more with a pre-existing condition, at least in huge numbers, when you're getting it through your employer. So that's problem number one with Jimmy Kimmel, is he already had health insurance. The problem number two that he didn't mention is that Children's Hospital is a charity hospital. A lot of people are coming in there with Medicaid, and the only way that people can get covered is not just through Medicaid, it's because there's a bunch of charity that's coming in and supplementing the Medicaid to pay the doctor. I know this because the doctor who operated on Jimmy Kimmel's son is a guy named Vaughn Starnes, and he operated on my daughter when she was a year and a half old. So we were at the same hospital with the same doctor. The vast majority of patients there, I believe, were on Medicaid. And they were able to get care because of the charity that was involved. So my solutions are twofold. There's a long answer, but it's a complex question. So the answer is, one, private charity needs to be increased so that we can help pick up the slack, because if that doesn't happen, conservatives, note to us, we need to give more charity, because if we don't do it, the government's going to try to. Okay, and solution number two is that we have to have a phased out program that takes care of the people for whom it's too late to actually make good decisions, but still encourages people to make good decisions now about buying their insurance, which means there must be a risk attached to not buying insurance.
One last
yeah,
comment.
sorry.
Just one ending comment. Two things. First of all, if you're encouraging people to buy health insurance, at the age of 20 or an age like that, they're not going to have, the income or the percentage to donate as much to a better insurance plan, You don't need a terrific insurance plan when you're 20. You need a catastrophic insurance plan when you're 20. And the truth is that most of the time you need a catastrophic insurance plan generally. You shouldn't have to go to an insurance company if you have a flu. You should be able to go to a doctor and pay cash. And also, when you're 20, there are still people with pre-existing conditions that would jack up those costs, and getting it early might not help.
100%. But again, this is a time lapse question, because the fact is that my daughter was covered under my insurance, right? If you're under 20, you're covered on your parents' insurance typically. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. Thank you for being here today. I'm sure it takes guts to say those things, especially at a place like Northwestern, so thank you.
Oh, it's fine. I do it for a living.
So you mentioned a couple times about how there needs to be a national dialogue focusing on various social issues. Do you think that your caustic left versus right, liberal versus conservative language helps you change people's views, or do you think that your success, your fame, this tour that you're doing, comes from being a sounding board for people who already have established views very similar to yours?
So I think some of both. So I will agree that some of the things that I say are caustic. One of the reasons that I do this in caustic manner is because if you're entertaining people, then you're also getting them to listen to you. We live in an entertainment culture, and all of that is true. Second thing is, the reason that I do that is because the most common left argument against people on the right is, you're mean, you're nasty, you're cruel, you're bad. It's not an argument, it's a character attack. By me getting aggressive, that basically says to the left, okay, back off, we're not going to make character attacks on each other because we can do it all day. Now we can have a discussion. So you may have noticed that the last couple of people who came up are people who disagree with me, and we've had a very cordial discussion. I'm more than happy to have cordial discussions. But first we have to take off the table the idea that I'm an asshole because you disagree with me. So the way to do that is by me saying, listen, if you think that, then that kind of makes you an asshole. So that's the way that I do that, is to disarm the character argument so we can actually get down to brass tacks. again, I think that the evidence is pretty good that I've convinced, this is not on me, it's because people listen, thank God, is that I've convinced a fair number of people. I mean, I do get dozens of letters a day from people on the left who've listened to my arguments, and it's caused them to at least think a little bit more deeply about the argument. There's room for a lot of various voices with a lot of various different approaches. I mean, you can approach it like Arthur Brooks, and that's wonderful. I love Arthur Brooks. But there needs to be somebody who says some of the tough things that people aren't willing to hear. And that's not just about me saying it in a caustic fashion. It's about me saying things that people don't want to hear. Like, people take it as caustic. When I say your life is in your hands, that seems to me not a particularly caustic thing to say, but people get offended by it because it's something they don't necessarily want to hear. When I say things like, if you're employed by an industry where there are jobs that are being lost to technology, Trump ain't going to bring it back, Hillary ain't going to bring it back, nobody's going to bring it back. When I say that, people get very upset because they want people to bring it back. But that's not me being caustic, it's the facts being caustic.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think that, you said people like to characterize you as an asshole. Do you think that's just because...
Not just my wife, yeah.
Oh. So, do you think that's because that's just a very personal attack on your character, or is that based on your views?
Well, I think that it's because of my views that they attack my character. I think that, I like to think that I'm a relatively nice guy, but the fact is that it doesn't matter how nice you are. Mitt Romney was a genial fellow, and they called him a guy who straps dogs to the top of his cars, wants to put you all back in chains, and has binders full of women because he hates women. Right? I mean, there's not a more genial person in politics, more kind-hearted, kind of genteel person in politics than Mitt Romney, and they basically called him Hitler, and that's why they'd spent that bullet by the time Trump came around, who legitimately is not the world's greatest guy.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro.
Howdy.
I just want to say thank you for everything you do. I don't have a question besides this. I want to know if you would sign your book.
Yeah, bring it up here right now, let's do it.
And if I could just shake my hand.
I'm always happy to shake hands so long as...
Hi, Ben. This is a Twitter question from Cairo Cuz. It says, when was the last time you changed your mind on some public policy? And why did you make that change?
So I changed my mind based on further evidence. So the last time that I remember changing my mind was on decriminalization of marijuana. So I used to be in favor of criminalization of marijuana. My views have shifted very libertarian on the drug war. And that's because as I saw more evidence that the drug war is a giant fail, and that fit with my general worldview, which is the government sucks at everything except breaking things, then... Now, one note, don't mistake my lack of support for the drug war for my support for drugs. People who smoke pot irritate me to an enormous degree, and I think they're wasting time and brain cells. But with that said, that's a case where I think that as the evidence makes itself clear, it's pretty clear the government doesn't know what to do with the war on marijuana, and they've wasted a lot of time and money and have hurt a lot of people in that war.
So my question just sort of focuses on two sort of different things you've been talking about. One, which is focusing on the decisions people make and how that influences how successful they are. And two, you made a comment saying, in America, we don't afford you, equality of wealth or things like that. We give you equality of access.
Well, equal access to rights, not equal
Okay,
access.
Okay.
There is a difference. What I mean by
Yes.
equal access to rights, obviously, is I mean that no one's going to get in your way, that the rights that you hold are the same as the rights that I hold, but when I'm and if somebody blocks them, then that's blocking your access. But what I don't mean is that a person who has $1 million in the bank is equally situated with a person with $5 in the bank, because obviously that's stupid.
Yes, and I would agree that that's stupid.
Good, we're in agreement on stupidity, all right.
Yeah, something we can agree on. I do want to sort of extend that into, I do personally believe that the number one factor in a lot of these sort of things are the decisions you make. But a lot of what affects your decisions is sort of where you start out, and sometimes that's like a long sort of cultural argument and things like that.
True.
But other times, It's something more basic like, well, if you weren't born into as wealthy a family, it's harder to go to a nicer college, and you're pressured to take another job so you don't finish high school, or you have to take care of, it's a single parent household, which you didn't decide, your parents made poor decisions.
Yes.
But then you have to take care of your little siblings or things like that. So then it becomes harder for you to maintain your job, and you lose that. So I think there's a lot of sort of things that
100%
affect
this
those
is correct, yeah.
3 sort of key tickets you've talked about that are heavily influenced by factors entirely out of a person's
Well, I
control.
mean, not having babies out of wedlock is definitely not influenced by factors beyond your control. I mean, unless you have uncontrollable genitalia. So the fact is that just because you had a single mom doesn't mean that you have to follow in the pattern. Bottom line is that when you have cycles of poverty, somebody's going to have to break that at some point, and that's going to take an act of will. When it comes to graduating from high school, the number of people who are dropping out of high school because they need to, support their family is incredibly low in the United States. But if that's the case, then I'll give you an example. There's a listener of mine who's a young woman, I think she's probably 18 years old, who emailed me the other day, and she said, you have your 3 rules, right? No, don't have babies before marriage and finish high school and then get a job. And she said, I love your show. I agree with everything you say. I also broke one of those rules. So I have a baby. I had a baby when I was 15 years old. And what should I do about that? And I replied to her, and I said, well, what's your social structure like? Did you have your parents nearby who can help out with your kid? Do you have a church that you belong to, people who you can rely on? And she said, well, I'm not really a member of a church. I don't have like a huge social structure. I have my mom. My mom's also a single mom, because there are these pathologies where there are generations of single mothers. And so what should I do? And she said, well, I went ahead and I got my GED, and now I'm trying to go to community college, but I don't have money for childcare. I don't have money for childcare. My mom works. So what should I do? And I said, well, why don't you put together a GoFundMe and get it to me, and I'll push it out there. And so she sent me a GoFundMe. I put $100 in the kitty, and an hour and a half later, she had $6,000. The reason that I did that, and the reason that I tell this story, is not because I'm such a wonderful dude, although I am. The reason that the reason that I tell this story is because there is a world of willing people who are willing to give and help you escape these things if you want to make the effort. There's whole groups of people out there. There's whole organizations dedicated to helping you escape making bad decisions, dedicated to helping you get out of poverty. And if people need to find these things, then please email me, email your church, email your synagogue. There are entire religions dedicated to this. And this idea that there are these inescapable chains of poverty, that no decision you make can help you escape these things, if that's true, then we're not doing a good enough job on a private level. But I don't think it's true. I think the American people are the most generous people on the face of the earth, statistically speaking. That is eminently true. Republicans, by the way, do give much more money to charity than Democrats, mainly because they're religious. And so our goal as individuals, not as a society, because I don't like to talk about our goals as a quote-unquote society. Our goals as individuals should be to help people make the right decisions so they can escape these bad decisions that they were about to make. And people's goals as individuals should also be not to make the bad decisions. These cycles cannot be broken by a government coming in and trying to fix them. Government tried to fix poverty in 1964. And the war on poverty has now been going for half a century, and by percentage, the same number of people are poor. Okay, so this is just not working. We're going to need to do something else, and it's going to need to come down to individual decision making.
Just to end this, I want to thank you for your personal kind charity, especially.
You don't have to. I didn't give you money.
I can thank you for your kindness to others, and I am very appreciative of everyone who does that. I just personally don't believe that that's going to be the solution for everyone out there. But once again, I thank you for coming and speaking here, and I thank you for advancing the cause of charity, even if you do it in a way that is politically different from my own.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
What do you view as the consequence of the left taking power in America?
Well, I mean, I think that if I haven't made this clear, I think that when you're talking about the left taking power of the government, the consequence is more intervention in our lives, more regulation, more redistribution of wealth. The left has a basic view of the government, which is that the government is there to guarantee positive rights. And what they mean by positive rights is taking something from someone and giving it to someone else. So a positive right to health care, when they say right to health care, they mean forcing my wife to provide health care at a price that she doesn't want to provide. And they've been putting a gun to somebody's head and then threatening them. The government is a big pointing the gun at somebody machine. That's what the government does. And so when the left takes control of that, then the government can either point that gun at people who are getting in the way of your exercise of your rights, or the government can point it at somebody else and force them to guarantee you things. And the left is about pointing the gun at people and forcing them to guarantee you things. And that holds true on everything from religious freedom, which will be quashed, to redistributionism, to government regulation on a whole variety of issues.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for coming out. I'm just kind of curious. I know you mentioned the ICE speaker who came in and got protested out, but
Yes.
What's your particular stance on the way we handle undocumented immigrants in this country? Because I'm aware that they aren't U.S. citizens, they don't have constitutional rights, but they are still people, and we should treat them with respect, and they have human dignity. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so let me start from this premise. My view on immigration is almost entirely libertarian if there were no welfare state. So my view on immigration is that free flow of labor is a good thing, but there are two mitigating factors. Mitigating factor number one is you can't come here to take advantage of the welfare systems, and mitigating factor number two is you have to accept the culture of the United States, which is to say the rights that are expressed in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which means a small government not guaranteeing bigger services through redistribution of income. But you know, that we don't have to, people come here to work, we don't have to give them the vote either. I mean, as long as you're coming here and not committing a crime and you just want to work, I don't really see that as being a particularly big problem. As far as people who are undocumented and violating the law to be here, the biggest problem as I see it is, again, twofold. One is taking advantage of the welfare system, and there is a net cost for people who are coming here illegally because they take advantage of the education system, for example. They take advantage of state systems. It's still forbidden to get federal welfare, but there are state systems in California where I live. There are tremendous state support systems for undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants. And so here's my view. The government has every right to decide who comes in the country and who doesn't come into the country. That is true for new immigrants, it's true for people who are already here. If you come here and we feel that you're a net benefit to the citizens of the United States, you're coming in here and you are going to work hard and fly right, and you're going to be a great addition to the United States, you respect our view of human nature and of government, and you just want to be part of this great mission, then more power to you, come on in. The same thing holds true for undocumented immigrants. Just because you've been here for 10 years, if you've been relying on welfare, then I think you ought to go. If you are not a net benefit to the United States, you ought to go. A citizenry gets to say who gets to join and who doesn't get to join. And you know, if that means that there's a father and a mother, and the father is a bad addition, but the mother is a good addition, then they're going to have to make a family decision as to where they live, just like we would have to in any other family situation. But it seems weird to me that the government can go through 150 million tax forms every year, but the government doesn't have the power to go through 11 million applications from illegal immigrants, interview people, and decide who's going to add to the country economically and culturally and who's going to detract. So in other words, do it on an individual level. The big problem is that you have people on both sides who don't want to do it on an individual level. They want to say, okay, all illegal, I don't use undocumented because that's a euphemism, all illegal immigrants out. Okay, I think that that's silly. There are people who are illegal immigrants who have been here working hard and doing the right things, but there are lots of people who haven't. And people on the left who say everybody should stay because they've been here and they're just like us. Well, not everybody is just like us, and we should take that into account.
Hi, Ben. My name is also Ben. That's about it, though. That's all we have in common. You spoke a lot about how the crime and a lot of the issues in America come with having sex out of wedlock and having basically broken up families. I was wondering your opinion on mass incarceration in this country and how that affects and ties into victimization, specifically related to black and brown people, but I'll get there in a second. America has 25% of the world's prison population with 5% of the world's population. So obviously a lot of your families where kids go wrong, they don't have the support systems. That's why their fathers or their mothers are in prison. And you can look at very concrete examples of ways where the law has not been applied equally to black versus white people. So one example of that is in 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, where they punished crack cocaine, which black people used more than white people, at a 100-to-1 rate, which was recently reduced to 18-to-1 under Barack Obama. So I don't see how you can claim that everyone is treating equally and no one is victimized on a systemic level when you have laws that punish one race that is more likely to use one type of drug more than another race, when it's actually been shown that among kids our age, white people and suburban kids are more likely to use drugs in schools than black inner city kids.
Okay, so there's a lot there, and you're right, we disagree on everything. So, so to begin with, I don't believe in the concept of mass incarceration because that implies that the police are going into black communities with a lasso, rounding people up and taking them to jail for no reason. I don't think that's happening. Every person who is in jail has had a trial or a plea. The idea that people are just being grabbed and thrown into prison to keep alive some sort of prison industrial complex where the prison masters are the ones running the system, I don't see evidence of that. As far as the 1986 law, I think that it's important to put this into context. And the context is that that law was originally pressed by black legislators from inner cities who were sick of watching crack cocaine destroying their communities. And the reason for the disparity is because crack was more easily distributable and significantly more effective than powder cocaine. It is also the fact that the vast majority of people who are distributing and using crack cocaine were black. You know, it's a drug that the vast majority of people who distribute and use are white? Crystal meth. Guess what the penalty is for 1 ounce of crystal meth versus 1 ounce of crack cocaine? They are identical. They are identical because they are easily distributed and they are distributed in similar forms. So the idea that this was just some sort of attempt to grab black people off the street and throw them in jail for no reason so we could have a permanent underclass of people with no fathers, this seems to me like a giant conspiracy theory with little evidence to support it. As far as the idea that these communities would be better if we just release people onto the streets, so I think it's important, again, to note the statistics here. The fact is the vast majority of people who are in jail for drug crimes are in for distribution, not merely for use. The idea that it's a black kid who's just smoking crack on the street who's getting picked up by the cops and thrown in jail, the justice system doesn't have time for that. Okay, the vast majority of even possessions that are pled down from distributions. Now, I've said earlier, I'm not in favor of the drug war. Okay, but I can tell you something. The people who are currently acting in criminal fashion in the drug war aren't going to be out acting as model citizens as a general rule. A lot of those people are going to be committing other crimes because this has been the history of the United States. When you make a substance illegal, the people who are criminals were criminals before and they're criminals after. Al Capone was not going to turn into a banker after Prohibition ended. And the same thing is true for a lot of the people who are committing criminal acts by distributing illicit substances. So I think that to pretend that the epidemic of single motherhood is going to end, all these guys are just going to decide, you know what, I've decided to marry that girl, I'm going to stay home, and it's going to be like Leave It to Beaver. When they were dealing crack on the corner to 12-year-old kids the day before, I think that's a little bit of a myth.
Yeah, I want to respond to one specific point. You were saying the idea that cops are going into black communities and lassoing up black people is completely ridiculous. How would you explain the amount of black people in jail currently?
Higher numbers of black people committing crimes.
Well, that's not the case.
It is absolutely the case.
It's been statistically shown that white people use drugs just as much as
And
black
as I
people.
said, people are generally not arrested for using drugs. They're generally arrested for drug distribution in the drug war.
Do white people not distribute drugs?
Well, they don't in terms of proportionality with regard to, I mean, the idea that, again, you need to show me the statistics on drug distribution. So the burden is on you to prove the disparity, not on me to prove the non-disparity.
I don't see how either of us can have, we should have an equal distribution of trying to prove the disparity.
Well, you're the one who's accusing the criminal justice system of wild injustice. Again, I don't have the statistics in front of me, so it's hard for me to cite statistics on that particular aspect of drug distribution, but you'd have to show that there are a bunch of white people who are distributing drugs to the same extent as the black people in jail, and then tell me that they're not being treated equally. You can't just suggest that drug use is equal to drug distribution, because statistically it's not.
Yo. All right, so I just wanted to start by thanking the College Republicans, Young America's Foundation, and of course Ben Shapiro. As like an immigrant, a Muslim, fairly liberal person, I think this is probably the best event that I've been able to access just because I'm not sitting in the audience and nodding for an hour.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I really do appreciate the platform for free dialogue. I think it's extremely important for there to be free speech so the good ideas sort of crowd out the bad ones. The reason I'm kind of here today is because, while I was sitting there, and I've noticed this in a lot of your videos, which I do spend some time watching.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Definitely entertaining, yeah. So, like yesterday, right before coming here, or before I slept, I watched you on Piers Morgan talking about gun control.
Mm-hmm.
I heard you for an hour today, and I think what I realized is I think the first step is talking about free speech, and I think the left can definitely work on that. The second step is using solid, sound I guess, evidence for your speech so that truly you have good ideas crowding out the bad. And I just wanted to take issue with a few things that you mentioned that I felt were a bit more sensational, a bit more, I guess, I know you're from like a lawyer background, so I can see.
No, go for it.
Yeah, so like you mentioned for rape on college campuses from 1995 to 2002 was a statistic you used.
Because those are the last available statistics from the BJS.
Sure. So there's current statistics that you think have, I guess, methods that are unjustified because it's self-identified, but that's contemporary. And you're looking at something that started 20 years ago, and then making up for the caveat that, okay, it's self-identified, so it might not actually reach that amount. So what I'm saying is, clearly we don't have sound data on this, and maybe not all of the self-identified reports are justified, but using a statistic that's 20 years old, even if it's the most contemporary one that you have, is, I think, unsound in terms of academic discourse.
So I agree with you. I'd like to have better statistics. Now let me ask you a question on that. Do you think that the rape rate in the United States on college campuses is closer to 6 in 1,000 or 250 in 1,000?
I definitely think it's somewhere in between, and I don't think I have.
No, but I mean, like, if you had to try and peg a number. I mean, I understand that I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to iterate. I'm not like a scientist or a statistician, and I don't claim to or posture to be, and I don't think you should either. If you don't have statistics,
Do you think that it has increased
no,
10,000%?
What I'm saying is, for you to criticize a certain community of using a statistic, 1 out of 5, as sensational or ridiculous,
Because the people who actually created that statistic say that it's being misused.
Sure, and you're using a statistic that's 20 years old.
Because it's the best statistic available. Again, if you're willing to give me better statistics, I am more than willing to hear them.
No,
and as
fair.
I've said, if you provide me new evidence, I'm more than willing to change my mind.
Fair, yeah. No, I mean, I don't think I have the political knowledge to debate that. So, like, just a couple things. So, moving forward, I think you talked about, I don't know, you said, like, you mentioned Jim Crow laws and slavery for what kind of pushed black people back, and you said, okay, this is in the past. Again, this is an example of taking the opposition's argument, making a caricature of it, and dropping it down real fast. Everyone knows about Jim Crow. Everyone knows about slavery. Not as many people know about, for example, redlining in Chicago in the 1960s that the CPL had to push out by 1964. These kinds of systems have been entrenched for years. I think most people have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on how this has developed a system of entrenchment for these communities. Even today, under Rahm Emanuel, who's a Democrat and I think is wrong, implements TIF increment financing that takes money out of Western and Southern Chicago and reappropriates them to places that don't really need it as much. Clearly, there's a lack of funding. He closed 47 schools over the past years. What I'm basically trying to say is there's a lot of factors going on in these communities that are predominantly black, Hispanic, etc. And for you to simply say that, okay, Jim Crow happened 50 years ago, racism hasn't increased, is a bit, I think, again, insincere, because I don't believe that racism has, I do believe that racism has decreased, and, we're saying the N-word less, sure, but I don't think that racism at a systemic level has decreased, because the same communities that were affected in the 1960s, those people are still alive.
That's a wild accusation. I mean, I'm with you all the way up till the end. When you say there's a lot of complexity to these arguments, I agree. There's a lot of complexity to these arguments.
Yeah,
I'll tell you where there's no complexity, and that is the only way you are going to get out of the current problems that you are in is by relying on yourself to make good decisions. That's not to say that there aren't obstacles, and if there are obstacles that you can name, I'm more than happy to stand there and fight them with. If you can show me evidence of redlining by a bank in which a black person and a white person are being treated unequally with exactly the same application, I will stand next to you and root for them to be prosecuted in court, because that's illegal under the Civil Rights Act. But if you're going to suggest that racism has not decreased over the last 50 years, it's just sort of hidden, there is no evidence to suggest that whatsoever.
Sorry, I might have misspoke. So I agree with you. That was my bad. I don't think racism has increased. It's absolutely decreased. But I think that the institutions that existed 50 years ago haven't really vanished. The title character of the Atlantic story, Clyde Ross, I went to his house. He is experiencing the same things that he experienced 50 years ago. The government will come by. And I know you say that the government shouldn't fix this, and I agree. I'm just saying the government shouldn't make it worse. The government comes by. They say, hey, we're providing subsidies for these communities to become better. You can use it for paint for your house, better windows, anything that the public can see to make it look better. But he doesn't have heating in his house, but he can't use it for that because that's just not the system that's in place.
Right.
All I'm saying is
the government sucks, yeah.
But I totally agree with you on that. But all I'm trying to say is,
so come to the dark side.
Yeah, I guess all I'm trying to say is I definitely agree that these are complicated. I think the left and the right, they take small points and they sensationalize them to create a political platform. I would just appreciate it, since you are a journalist and not a politician, to do the same kind of due diligence when you really offer input, because a lot of people listen to you, a lot of people respect your
Well,
opinion.
okay, so again, the article that you're citing by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I haven't actually read that article, so I'm not going to claim knowledge of an article that you've read and I haven't. So I'll take your account of the situation for what it is, which is there's some guy who is apparently being victimized by the government because the government will only give him subsidies for X, Y, and Z, but he actually wants it for A, B, and C. My answer to that is that it's not the government's job to provide subsidies for anyone. And if the government is mal-appropriating subsidies, I object to that regardless of the race of the person. Like, I object to subsidies to the ethanol boondoggle in Iowa, which is basically white people. I object to subsidies to Wall Street. I object to all these subsidies. I don't think the government should be involved at all. And this fellow who, was victim to pretend that systematized discrimination under Jim Crow that was happening in 1960 is the same as a badly run government program in 2017 because they want to give you money for your windows but not for your water heater. Again, I don't see the relationship between the two, and to suggest that the banks are operating in the same way now as they were operating in 1960, I don't see the evidence for that either. I'm happy to look at evidence, but I need actual evidence. I can't just base it on headlines.
Hi, Ben. I'm Matt. I'm a big fan of your work, in particular the Ben Shapiro Thug Life videos. I enjoy a lot.
I can't take credit for those, but yeah.
So I was hoping you could address a couple things. So I really enjoyed your book, Bullies, although a lot of the arguments and points made in there were from, I believe, 2012, and in particular the Romney-Obama election.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could address how those trends have evolved over time, and in particular, if you feel the recent presidential election was almost a backlash against some of those trends. And then additionally, I was hoping you could talk about maybe what we as students can help do to prevent a culture of bullying, and in particular to fight back against the one-sided conversations that a lot of times the administration.
So brief answer. I think that with regard to the messages in Bullies, I think they are certainly apropos to current politics, and I think there was a backlash against the feeling. Like, people say that it was a bunch of Trump voters in the Midwest who decided that they were angry at the current system just because the current system was because they were poor and people hadn't been fulfilled or whatever. I don't think that's really what happened. I think there were a bunch of people who lived in these blue-collar states in the Rust Belt, and they said, I'm sick of being called a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe. At least Trump doesn't think that I'm mean and nasty and a deplorable, and therefore I'm voting for Trump. And there was an attempt by the Democrats to polarize Americans along racial, ethnic, sexual orientation lines, and they objected to it. And so it was more of a cultural fight, I think, than it was an economic fight. In fact, unemployment correlated really highly in those swing states with voting for Hillary Clinton, not with voting for Trump. As far as your second question, I'm trying to remember what it was. Reiterate for a second.
So I was mostly just wondering, like, what
what you can do as students to fight back.
can do.
So, I think that the first thing that you can do as students is talk to people on an individual level. This doesn't mean you have to engage in every conversation. You should determine whether a conversation is useful or not, whether someone wants to have an honest conversation or not, or whether they're just there to beat you up. And if they are, then maybe it's good for practice. Maybe it's good for you to hear the other side so you can do a back and forth. But there's no substitute for individual conversation, because that's how people are actually convinced. And I think you see by the number of people who are liberals in the audience. And notice, I've used left all night. I don't use liberals except for people who actually believe there ought to be an open discourse. So thank you to all the liberals in the audience who showed up tonight. A round of applause for them, because I appreciate it. Those are the people who, yeah, you, dude. Those are the people who I think you can have an honest conversation with, and I think those are the people who you're going to have to stand beside to fight against some of the people who try to shut down these debates based on character attacks rather than merit.
Thanks so much.
Last question.
So thank you for coming out this afternoon. I had a question about your statistics about how there's a disproportionate amount of single motherhood in African American communities, right?
Right.
And so starting in 1960 or 1970 with Roe v. Wade, we had this boom of legalization of abortion, which I kind of appreciate your understanding the pro-life argument. I was very pro-choice until I heard that, and it kind of made me in that middle ground of like, oh, I don't really know what to do. So I did some research. And so finding that when abortion was legalized, you look at Romania and then you look at America, right? This is the Freakonomics argument. You saw that there was a decrease in crime between people under 25 in the 1990s. And so this kind of made me think that maybe this is a correlation between that of the white and African American communities, because at that time, African American youths were predominantly low income. So they didn't have access to that form of contraception, which I think is why we feel that today, while there is this huge proportion of, what you're saying, 70% of single motherhoods are African American. If not, that's the reason. I was just curious, what is the reason, and then what is the solution to that?
Okay, so abortion is not the reason for the drop in crime. First of all, even if it were the reason for the drop in crime, it's not an excuse for killing babies. So, so that's number one. The evidence that it's not the reason for the drop in crime, Barry Latzer makes this argument in a book it's a very good book called The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America. And he talks about the fact that there was a huge violent crime spike in the United States in the mid-1980s. And it only ended in about 1994. From 1994 to 2010, there was an enormous violent crime decrease. Okay, the problem is that abortion, the top coterie of people who commit crimes are people between the ages of 14 and 20. That is the key age where people commit crimes. And what you see is that abortion was legalized in 1973. What you would assume then is that the crime rates would begin to drop in the late 80s. Right? They begin to drop in like 1987. Right? That's when people who had been born but weren't would have turned 14 or 15 years old. Right? But that's not what happened. The crime rates only began to drop in 1994, 1995, coincident with something Hillary Clinton ran away from, her husband's crackdown on crime. And once you put more cops on the streets and put people in jail for crime, it turns out they're not on the streets to commit crime. So the correlation doesn't actually fit. So the idea that that's the case, it also doesn't make sense because the fact is that the number of abortions has decreased markedly over the last 10 or 15 years, and you haven't seen a consummate spike in crime. So abortion rates started to decrease by the mid-90s. And so you would figure that there would have been a big spike in crime around 2008, 2009, no big spike in crime. So the correlation doesn't even fit. If you're going to, correlation doesn't equal causation, but in order for there to be causation, there has to at least be some proof of correlation. There's not even proof of correlation.
That was my question. My question was more or less, what is the reason why there's such a disproportionate amount of single mothers in the African-American poverty, like in that realm of?
Because, okay, so the real reason that there's a lot of single motherhood in the black community is because single motherhood has increased tremendously across all communities. So it used to be that in 1960, 5% of white women were single mothers. Today it's 40% of white women. So all across, it's increased. Single motherhood in the black community has been a bigger problem than in the white community because, yes, of pathologies of slavery. That goes all the way back to, back in slave times, the rate of single motherhood was really high because of forcible separation of families, and that carried over into Jim Crow as well, although it was beginning to decline actually in the 1950s, in the 1940s and the 1950s. With the explosion of welfare, which was directly targeted at low-income communities, which happened to be disproportionately minority, now there was an actual economic incentive to continue in pathologies of single motherhood. That if you were thinking about getting married before you had the baby, now maybe you didn't think quite as hard about it because after all the government was there to pick you up. And so the single motherhood rate continues to rise at a very high rate, but it's rising similarly at a high rate in the white community too. So I don't want to pretend it's solely a black problem, single motherhood. It isn't. There's a very high single motherhood rate in the black community, high rate in the white community, high rate in the Hispanic community. That's mainly because of the sexual revolution and the ideas from the left that a child doesn't need a mother and a father, and that there's some sort of inherent virtue that attends to being a single mother, which is really an irritating thing. There's a lot more virtue that attends to being a responsible mother, marrying dad, and then there being two parents there to help raise the kid. It's a source of never-ending annoyance to me that the way the popular culture treats disparate situations is that my wife, who's responsible enough to get married, wait a few years, have a job, have kids, that in the heroism pantheon, she is secondary to the girl who decided to get pregnant out of wedlock at 19 and live in poverty. That just doesn't make any sense. Good decisions should be rewarded by society.
What's the solution, though?
The solution is
Poor income households who are disproportionately African-American.
okay. So the ones who've already had kids, or the ones who have not had kids yet?
Each day and just in the community.
I know. I'm asking you. Are you talking about the ones who have kids already, or the ones who don't have kids already? Okay, so the ones who have kids already, the solution is that we have to have a social network that is built up for them, and that can't be provided by government. Okay, that needs to be provided by a growing charitable association base. It needs to be attended to by a religious community. A huge percentage of the black community still goes to churches. Those churches should take a heavy role in encouraging marriage, and they should take a heavy role in helping people pick up after themselves once life mistakes have been made. And I think that many of those churches are working on that. But those mistakes cannot be unmade by society just by handing people checks, because all that does is prolong the pathology. So what you really do have to do is help as you have to have family members that help you out. You have to have a social network that helps you out, and that's going to be rebuilt over a course of time. There's no immediate solution. I'm not going to pretend that I have an immediate turnkey solution for a single mom who made a lot of mistakes, is living in poverty, and now I'm going to turn her into a millionaire overnight. I can't do that. The government can't do that. No one can do that. The government can't take my money and give it to her and make her wealthy. The government can't take your money and give it to her and make her responsible. Okay, the fact is that individual decisions matter even after you've made a bad one.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Hello, everyone. Hey, I'm just stopping by to remind you that liberals are insane. Social justice warriors are becoming more violent and triggered than ever before. Anyways, be sure to subscribe to KGPPV on YouTube and have a blessed day. Yeah, man.
Bias toward the mother. That's been true for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. But to pretend that that is the main problem facing inner city communities, for example, ignores the fact that the vast majority of people who are having babies out of wedlock are having them out of wedlock. They're not having them in wedlock, and then dad is taking off. Dad's taking off because they never got married. Okay, this is why marriage is a prerequisite.
Well, I believe, Ben, that if you look at, say, the south side of Chicago and the west side of Chicago, if you look at that and the crime that is there today, you can trace that back to Jim Crow, to the war on drugs, to mass incarceration. And when fathers were taken out in large numbers over a long duration, you now have set the stage where you have so many children being had out of wedlock because the family unit has broken down in these.
No, the increase in single motherhood is not based in Jim Crow. Because the fact is that at the end of Jim Crow, the black single motherhood rate was 20%. Today it's 72%. Okay, so did society get more racist? How did that happen? Was it just a ticking time bomb that they left under the kitchen table? The fact is that people are having babies out of wedlock now because there are government structures in place that basically incentivize people to have babies out of wedlock, and that's the real problem. Now, in terms of crime, obviously crime is involved with single motherhood. What I'm suggesting is that there are two ways to tackle this problem. One is a broader cultural critique in which we say to people, you need to get married, and that means getting people involved in church and synagogue, getting people involved in a social network that encourages people to get married before they have babies. That's a long-term project because it takes 100 years for an entire society to devolve to the point where a majority of babies are being born out of wedlock in a community, or a vast minority in the white community. That's one way to tackle it. A shorter-term way to tackle crime is to put all the criminals in prison. Because again, I think that sets off a chain reaction that's actually good. And the chain reaction is that now you can have businesses invest. I'm not going to take my money and invest in a store that I think is going to be robbed tomorrow because the crime rate is high. I'm only going to invest where I think the cops are going to protect. And if there are no cops there to protect, it's hard for me to invest. Once I invest, that creates a property tax base or a local taxation base. And now you actually have the money, if you want a good public school, to actually put together a good public school. So all of these things need to happen at once. But the only quarrel I have with you at all is I think that you're taking an anecdote and expanding it out statistically where that's not actually statistically valid.
So you don't believe that the federal incentives to the states, for the states to receive federal funding based on their forced collection of child support?
No, I'm not arguing with you on that. You may very well be right. I don't know enough about that to answer that question. All I'm saying is that if you're talking about child support as the lead problem in these communities, there we disagree. I'm sorry, I have to move on because there's a lot of other questions.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your talk today, and that's coming from someone who disagrees with basically everything you say.
Oh, good, I'm glad.
But yeah,
thank you for coming.
So today you had a Twitter thread in response to Ted Lieu's comments on health insurance and the CBO report that came out about why pre-existing conditions should be charged more. For those with pre-existing conditions that become priced out of the market due to them being charged more, which I understand your reasoning behind, car insurance, stuff like that. I read the thread.
Well, I mean, to reiterate my point for people who don't understand, just so if you're coming in late to this conversation, Ted Lieu tweeted something out about how it's ridiculous, basically, for insurance companies to charge people with pre-existing.
On running for governor 2018 here in the state of Illinois, and I wanted to specifically address where you spoke about victimization and people coming from impoverished neighborhoods that that poverty wasn't kind of what you equated to for criminal activity, and that addressing crime by putting more police into these inner city communities would be the resolution to said criminal activity. I just want to challenge that thought process on a couple of points.
Sure.
Beginning with my personal opinion, and some of this is going to be rooted in facts and others just in my observations,
That's fine.
is that the majority of crime that's being committed in these inner city neighborhoods, if we look at prison statistics, if we look at gang violence, we look at drug abuse, we look at teen pregnancy, suicide and depression amongst our youth, there's one common denominator. That common denominator is that these children are growing up in fatherless homes. They're growing up in fatherless homes not because fathers are not present and because we have a plethora of deadbeat fathers, which has been painted through through the media that there's millions of deadbeat fathers out there. That's simply not the truth. What is the truth is that the states have found it profitable by misappropriating Title IV funding through the Social Security Act from the federal government down to the states. The states take a parent, which is historically and statistically the father, they relegate them down to a visitor during a custody proceeding, such as my case. So I hope that you can smear this over your website. They reduce me down to a visitor status to justify a child support order. When they do that and they force that collection process, they receive federal funding directly to the state.
Okay, so sorry, I don't want to break up the long paragraphs there, but you know more about custody battles than I do. Okay, I will just say that obviously custody battles only take place in a situation in which there's a conflict between the spouses. I mean, I assume that you and your spouse don't get along great.
Well,
I mean,
let me finish just addressing. I know I'm long-winded.
Sorry, one more comment. The fact is that it is not custody battles. The custody battles are not the reason 70% of black kids are born out of wedlock and 40% of white kids are born out of wedlock. It's because people are having sex out of wedlock and having babies.
That's correct. But when that child support order is put in place, okay, in order to justify the support order, they have to take one parent, which historically is the father, and say, you're only going to get every other weekend. And when we do that, we have set the stage for emotional and mental challenges for those individuals. And again, if you look at teen pregnancy statistics, drug abuse statistics.
So I agree with you about the correlation between all these terrible things and single motherhood. I just disagree with you statistically that cases of father visitation and divorce cases represent even a large minority of the cases of single motherhood. Again, the vast majority of, if we're talking about the sort of culture of single motherhood that's been created in the United States, it is not about custody hearings. It is about the fact that people are getting pregnant before they're married, out of wedlock, and having babies without a father even in the home. This is not to diminish the problems in custody battles. There's no question that a lot of custody law is.
Before this video starts, I'd just like to make an announcement. I have the Liberal Tears mug for $14.99 on my website. It is the first link in the description if you want to go pick one up. Don't worry if it breaks when it comes to your house. I'll send you another one for free out of my pocket. I don't care. I want you to get your Liberal Tear mug. It comes in Liberal Tears white with the face, black with the face, white without the face, and black without the face. So pick whichever one you want, and it'll come to your door in about 3 to 5 days. So that should be epic. First link in the description. Thank you. Let's go on with the video.
Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. And as I say, if you disagree, then I'm always eager to talk with people who disagree because it's fun to have discussions. So you get to go first if you disagree.
Well, I didn't expect the first one down here, but I disagree with you on a couple points, Ben.
Sure.
First, let me introduce myself. My name is Cash Jackson. I'm a retired Navy veteran. And
well, thank you for your service.
Thank you. I am also